At my sister's birthday dinner, my mother raised her glass and told everyone that Rachel was the pride of the family, then turned to me and said, "Tonight is not about you." I sat in silence, the gift I had chosen clutched in my hands, realizing once again that in their story, I was nothing but a shadow. My name is Clara Hayes, and 4 years later in that same city, my parents would be begging me to save them in a hospital bed. I walked into the restaurant on a chilly February evening in downtown Denver, carrying a gift bag that I had spent hours putting together. My sister Rachel was turning 36, and the place my parents had chosen was one of those polished steakhouses with dim lighting and white tablecloths. I was 34, still hoping in some corner of my heart that showing up with something thoughtful would mean they might actually see me. As soon as I stepped inside, I heard the clinking of glasses and my mother's voice ringing with pride as she raised a toast. All eyes were on Rachel, glowing under the lights, her new dress shimmering, as if she had been born to be adored. My father smiled wide already halfway through his scotch nodding, like he had raised the most extraordinary daughter on earth. I moved closer, waiting for someone to notice me. I waved lightly at a cousin, but she turned back to her table. When I finally reached the long table where my family sat, the only empty chair was at the far end near the service doors. I slid into it quietly, balancing the gift bag on my lap. The waiter passed me by twice before offering water. From across the room, I could hear my parents showering Rachel with compliments. She was the pride of the family, the one who carried their legacy, the one who had everything lined up perfectly. I tried to join the conversation. I leaned toward my mother when she paused to sip her wine, and said softly that I was glad we could all be together. She turned her head slightly, her smile frozen, and said without lowering her voice that tonight was Rachel's day, and I should not try to make it about myself. My cheeks burned. My father kept staring at his glass, swirling the ice like nothing had been said. Rachel laughed at something one of her friends whispered, and the sound hit me like a reminder of every time I had been left standing in the shadows. The dinner stretched on. Plates arrived, laughter bounced down the table, and I felt like a ghost occupying a chair no one had reserved. I placed the gift on the corner near my mother, a carefully chosen journal wrapped in soft paper, something Rachel had once mentioned wanting. No one looked at it. I picked at the bread basket, chewing without tasting, my eyes blurring, as I remembered high school graduations, recitals, birthdays, all the times Rachel had been celebrated while I stood aside. When the cake came out glowing with candles, my parents leaned in close to Rachel, singing with the guests, clapping, shouting her name like it was the only one that mattered. I clapped along half-heartedly, my voice caught in my throat. The light from the candles reflected in Rachel's eyes, and for a moment, I realized with a heavy certainty that I was never going to be part of the picture my parents painted of this family. I pushed my chair back slowly so the sound of the legs scraping the floor would not draw attention. I set the gift bag down on the empty chair beside me, knowing no one would ask where it came from. I stood up, smoothed my jacket, and walked toward the exit. My heart pounded in my ears. The noise of laughter and clinking glasses faded behind me, replaced by the quiet hum of the city outside. I stepped onto the sidewalk, the winter air sharp against my face, and for a moment I let myself breathe. Inside, they were still celebrating their perfect daughter, framed by the glow of candles, while I stood alone under the streetlight, invisible in every way that counted. That was the night it sank in, fully the night I understood I was never going to be more than a shadow in their story. I turned my back on the restaurant and walked down the block. My steps slow but steady, each one heavier than the last. The cold air on that street carried me backward into years I had tried to bury, moments when I had first learned what it felt like to be invisible. As a child in Boulder, my report cards had been filled with straight A's, ribbons from science fairs, and certificates for perfect attendance. Each time I brought one home, I waited for their eyes to light up. My father would nod, quickly mutter "good job," and go back to his newspaper. My mother would smile thinly and ask if I had congratulated Rachel for winning her debate competition. My sister's achievements were always followed by balloons, dinners out, or a new outfit from the mall. Mine lived in a shoebox under my bed, silent proof that I had once mattered at least to myself. I remember sophomore year when I came home clutching a regional math trophy, the medal still warm in my hands. Evelyn glanced at it and said she hoped I would not gloat in front of Rachel since Rachel had just been accepted onto the cheer team. That evening, my father ordered pizza, and Rachel's friends filled the living room laughing and posing for photos. My trophy sat on the kitchen counter next to a pile of unopened mail. I touched it once before heading upstairs, listening to the thumping music beneath my feet, knowing the celebration was not mine. By the time Rachel graduated high school, my parents surprised her with a silver Honda Civic wrapped in a red bow. She screamed, leapt into their arms, and thanked them through tears. I stood to the side with my camera, asked her to pose, and caught the way my mother beamed like she had just secured her family's legacy. A year later, when it was my turn to graduate, there was no car, no party, not even a card. I had already secured a scholarship to the University of Colorado and worked 2 jobs to cover what it did not pay. My parents said they were proud I could handle things on my own. I thought college might change something, that independence would earn me a seat at the table. Instead, it only reinforced the script. Rachel called home asking for money to cover books and was wired funds within the hour. I called to share that I had made Dean's List, and my father chuckled and said, "Of course you always figure things out." I worked late nights in the campus library shelving books, then rose early to serve coffee before class. Each paycheck stretched across rent, groceries, and gas, but I wore my exhaustion like armor. If no one else cared, I would. Maggie entered my life during those years, a fellow nursing student with a sharp wit and a kind heart. She saw things others missed. One Thanksgiving, I brought her home for dinner, hoping maybe her presence would soften my parents. When I started to share a story about winning a research grant, my mother cut me off mid-sentence to hand Rachel the floor so she could recount a modeling gig she had landed. Maggie caught my eye from across the table, her brow furrowed. Later, as we washed dishes, she whispered that she had never seen anything like it. That was the first time I realized I was not imagining the imbalance. The words that seared deepest came not from Rachel or my mother, but from my father. I had asked him if he thought I was doing enough, if he ever worried about me the way he worried about Rachel. He looked at me over his reading glasses and said, "Clara, you will always be fine. You do not need us." It sounded almost like a compliment, but it was a sentence that cut me out of their circle permanently. Fine meant I was not fragile, not deserving of attention, not worth the effort. It meant I could be ignored without guilt. The final blow came at my college graduation. I stood in my cap and gown, scanning the bleachers, hoping to see them waving. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother apologizing, explaining they were stuck at one of Rachel's events and would celebrate later. I walked across the stage alone, the auditorium echoing with cheers for other names, other children whose parents had shown up. Outside, while classmates posed with bouquets and balloons, I held my diploma against my chest and told myself it was enough. But as the sun set behind the mountains, the truth settled heavy inside me. My place in this family had been written long before. I thought I could carry that truth quietly forever, bury it beneath long shifts and small victories. But I was wrong. Because years later, when everything collapsed and my parents were forced to look to me, those buried memories would come rushing back with a force I could no longer ignore. By 2019, I had carved out a life that did not depend on anyone's approval. I worked 12-hour shifts at Denver Health, starting as a regular floor nurse and slowly climbing my way to charge nurse. The hospital was chaotic most days, sirens and monitors filling my ears until they became background noise. But inside that chaos, I found something steady. Every decision mattered. Every second counted. And for once, I was judged not by who I was compared to, but by what I did in the moment. One night during a brutal winter storm, an ambulance brought in a man who had gone into cardiac arrest twice on the way in. The ER was overflowing, staff stretched thin, and panic was thick in the air. I remember moving without hesitation, calling for epinephrine guiding compressions, ordering a crash cart before anyone else could ask. My hands shook only after it was done, when his pulse steadied beneath my fingers. Dr. Patel, one of the senior physicians, pulled me aside later, his tired eyes softening as he said that if he were ever the one on that gurney, he would want me at his side. It was the first time in years I felt truly seen, not as someone's daughter or sister, but as myself. At home, I shared an apartment downtown with Lucas, a civil engineer who had a way of cutting through my silence. When I tried to brush off compliments or minimize my exhaustion, he would gently take my hand and remind me that it was okay to set boundaries even with family. He knew about the birthday dinners where my name never came up, the graduations they skipped the subtle erasures that built me. He never pushed me to confront them, but he made it clear that I deserved to draw a line. That spring, I got a call from my mother. Her voice was clipped, almost embarrassed, as she explained that she and my father needed to complete their advance directive paperwork at the clinic. I expected her to ask Rachel. Instead, she said they wanted me to handle it. At first, I thought I misheard. She continued explaining that because I worked in healthcare, it made sense. They trusted me with medical forms and decisions. It was not affection or respect in the way I had longed for. It was obligation dressed as trust. I scheduled the appointment, met them in a sterile office, and walked them through HIPAA releases and power of attorney forms. They signed without hesitation, listing my name as their proxy. I watched my father's pen scratch across the line with a kind of detached disbelief. Afterward, they thanked me quickly and moved on to discuss Rachel's latest project. I smiled politely, tucking the paperwork into a folder, but inside I felt a sting that lingered. They could ignore me at birthdays, erase me from photos, but when it came to emergencies, I was the one they relied on. That evening, I opened the email confirmation from the clinic. In black and white letters, it read, "Medical Proxy, Clara Hayes." My chest tightened. For years I had begged for recognition, and here it was only tied to crisis and duty. I closed my laptop and sat in silence. Lucas found me staring at the wall and asked if I was all right. I told him I was fine, but the truth was, that line of text haunted me more than any insult ever had. By 2021, I wore my scrubs like armor, walking confidently through the corridors of Denver Health, respected by my peers, but still unseen at home. Every time the phone rang with my mother's number, I wondered if it was another form to sign, another crisis to manage, never just a call to ask how I was. I thought I could live with that imbalance as long as my work gave me purpose. But underneath, attention grew, a sense that sooner or later the weight of all that unspoken history would come crashing back. And then, in the winter of 2022, the call came that proved I had been right all along. The call that evening was not from the hospital, but from Maggie, her voice urgent and low, as if she was speaking in secret. She had been at a local law office running errands for her department and overheard the name Hayes attached to property documents. She reached out to her friend Vincent, an estate lawyer, and he confirmed there was a draft transferring my parents' house in Boulder, along with a joint savings account, entirely into Rachel's name. My own name was nowhere. I felt the air leave my chest, as if someone had slammed a door inside me. That night, I drove past the old family home, its porch light still glowing like a beacon, the snow gathered in neat piles along the walkway. Through the window, I saw my mother and Rachel on the couch, heads tilted together in close conversation. I stayed in the car, hands gripping the steering wheel, forcing myself not to storm in. Instead, I hit record on my phone and captured their voices drifting through the cracked window when I rolled it down slightly. Rachel asked how soon the transfer could be finalized. My mother told her not to worry, that once the last signature was secured, everything would belong to her. My throat tightened. All those years of paying my own way, carrying my silence, and still I was erased in ink before I could even protest. The next morning I met Maggie for coffee. I showed her the recording, the faint hum of my mother's voice, promising Rachel the house, as if I had never existed. Maggie reached across the table and squeezed my hand, warning me not to confront them yet. She said opportunities always came, and that rushing in would only make me look desperate. I nodded, though every part of me ached to demand answers. Later that week, Vincent called me directly. He explained that the draft had been prepared, but was not yet valid, missing required signatures and review. He offered to send me a copy, and when I opened the email that night, my stomach turned. The house deed, the savings account, every asset my parents had accumulated was listed under Rachel's future ownership. I saved the file on an external drive labeled plainly enough that I would never forget. A few evenings later, I stopped by the house under the pretense of dropping off groceries. I lingered in the hallway when I heard my mother's laughter, warm and indulgent, as she wrapped her arms around Rachel. She told her that she was the future, that everything the family had built was meant for her. And then her tone dropped to a sharp edge as she added that I was nothing more than a shadow. I froze the grocery bag, biting into my hand, each word carving deeper than the last. I backed away quietly, leaving the bag on the counter without saying a word. Driving home that night, I clenched the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My mother's words replayed again and again. Shadow, disposable, forgotten. I pulled over on the side of the road and let the tears come not from weakness, but from the realization that any chance of winning their love had long since died. What I had left was evidence and the knowledge that sooner or later they would need me in ways Rachel never could manage. From that point forward, I stopped waiting for affection and began preparing for inevitability. I organized the recordings, secured the documents, and reminded myself that truth had a way of surfacing at the right moment. I no longer imagined family dinners where I might finally be included. Instead, I imagined the day when their careful plans unraveled, when the weight of their choices would return to crush them, and when my silence would no longer protect them. That day arrived faster than I expected, in the form of another call, that winter one that pulled me back into their lives whether I wanted it or not. The phone rang just after dusk on Christmas Eve, its sharp sound cutting through the quiet of my apartment. A nurse from Denver Health asked if I was Clara Hayes, and then told me my parents had been in a serious accident on Highway 36. My name was listed as their medical proxy, and they needed me to come immediately. I grabbed my coat without thinking, my heart hammering as I called Lucas to drive me. Snow blew sideways across the windshield as we sped toward the hospital, the kind of storm that made the world feel fragile. When I pushed through the automatic doors of the ER, the heat and fluorescent light nearly blinded me. Rachel was already there, pacing, mascara streaked down her face. She rushed at me, words tumbling out about how the car had spun, how Dad had been unconscious when they pulled him out. I asked if she had spoken with the doctors, and she shook her head, saying they would not tell her anything without the proxy. For a moment, the irony struck me. The golden child powerless in the one place that mattered. Dr. Patel appeared with a chart in hand, his expression grave. He explained that both of my parents had internal injuries and would need immediate surgery. He asked for authorization and insurance confirmation. Rachel dug through her purse, pulling out a credit card that was declined on the first swipe and again on the second. She turned helplessly to me, eyes wide. My stomach twisted as I handed over my own card and authorized a $5,000 deposit. Patel slid the papers across the counter. My hand shook as I signed the black ink, carving my name into responsibility I had never been allowed in life, but could not avoid now. The sound of monitors and overhead pages filled the silence. Lucas placed a steady hand on my shoulder, while Rachel collapsed into a chair, muttering that this could not be happening. Minutes stretched like hours, until a nurse guided me into the ICU bay, where my mother lay, her face pale against the sheets. Machines beeped in steady rhythm, wires and tubes surrounding her like a web. I stood frozen until her fingers twitched. Slowly her hand lifted and caught mine with surprising strength. Her eyelids fluttered and she whispered, hoarse and broken, that she needed me. Tears slid down her cheeks as she begged me not to leave her. For a second I could not breathe. 4 years earlier at Rachel's birthday party, she had cut me down with words that erased me. Now, in this sterile room, with the scent of antiseptic stinging my nose, she was pleading for me to stay. The reversal pressed down on me like a weight cruel and undeniable. I squeezed her hand and told her quietly that I was here. When I stepped back into the hallway, Rachel asked what she said. I told her nothing she needed to know. She glared at me, but there was fear behind it. fear that her place in the story had shifted. Dr. Patel approached again, explaining the risks of the surgery and that they needed immediate consent. He looked at me, not Rachel. My signature was the one that counted. I signed again, the pen digging into the paper harder than I intended. The doors to the operating wing swung open, and they wheeled my parents away, leaving me standing there with Rachel staring like she had just realized the pedestal she had lived on was crumbling. I leaned against the wall, exhaustion crashing over me. But inside I felt something else stir. This was only the beginning. The accident had cracked open the life they had built around Rachel, and soon the truth I had carried quietly would come spilling out where everyone could see it. By the next morning, the waiting room at Denver Health was crowded with relatives, neighbors, and distant cousins who had heard about the accident. Their voices filled the space with hushed speculation, their eyes darting between me and Rachel, as if measuring who truly belonged at the center of this crisis. Rachel clung to her phone, whispering frantically to anyone who would listen, while I sat quietly with the chart Dr. Patel had handed me. When Vincent arrived in his gray winter coat, he brought a different kind of weight into the room. He carried a slim briefcase and greeted me first, shaking my hand firmly. He asked to speak in front of the family, and before I could answer, the room hushed itself. He explained in plain terms that any transfer of property or financial assets my parents had been preparing would be put on hold. Because they were incapacitated, the law required a pause until their condition was evaluated and a proper guardian confirmed. Rachel's head snapped up, her face draining of color. She tried to protest, insisting that our mother had already promised her everything. Vincent stayed calm and repeated that without signed and notarized documents, nothing was valid. Dr. Patel entered moments later, clipboard in hand. He looked around at the gathered faces, then directed his voice toward the group. He said that legally and medically I was listed as the sole proxy for my parents. Any decision regarding their treatment would fall to me. Rachel shot up from her chair, demanding that the doctors consult her too. Patel met her gaze steadily and asked if she had any legal documentation naming her as guardian. She faltered, flipping through her purse, unable to produce anything. The silence that followed was louder than any accusation. The next decision came quickly. Patel outlined a new procedure my father needed and placed the consent forms on the counter. Every eye in the room followed as I walked up, took the pen, and signed my name clearly across the line. The sound of the pen scratching against paper seemed to echo off the sterile walls. Rachel's breath caught, as if the reality had finally sunk in. She muttered that this was not fair, that I was stealing her place. I turned toward her, my voice steady, and asked where the perfect daughter was now, why she could not take care of them when it mattered. Rachel opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her hands trembled as she clutched her phone tighter, her eyes darting toward the relatives who watched with a mix of pity and recognition. Maggie had arrived by then, slipping into the room with her nurse's badge still clipped to her scrubs. She took a seat beside my aunt and whispered what she had seen last night, how I had authorized the surgery, paid the deposit, and been the one the doctors trusted. One by one, the whispers spread until the weight of the truth settled over everyone. Rachel lowered her head, cheeks flushed, while my signature dried on the page that determined my father's survival. For the first time in years, the balance had shifted, not through shouting or confrontation, but through undeniable fact. I stood in the place they had tried to deny me, and no one could take it back. I sat down again, my chest tight with a strange mix of sorrow and vindication. The room buzzed softly with conversation, relatives avoiding Rachel's eyes and turning toward me instead. I could feel the tide turning, but deep down I knew this was not the end. The hospital walls held more secrets, and the unraveling of Rachel's perfect image had only just begun. The days that followed blurred into long hours of beeping monitors and clipped conversations with doctors. I rotated between my mother's room and my father's, coordinating medications, checking charts, and making sure the nurses knew exactly what was needed. Patel often glanced my way, as if reassured that someone competent was watching. Rachel drifted in and out, sometimes sitting silently in a corner, scrolling through her phone, sometimes vanishing altogether when the weight of responsibility became too heavy. It was during one of those absences that the first crack widened. A man in a dark suit approached the nurse's station, asking for Rachel by name. He introduced himself as a representative from her bank, his voice polite but firm. The account she had been using was severely overdrawn, multiple payments past due. He needed to speak with her immediately. When she finally appeared, he confronted her in front of half the family who had gathered in the waiting area. Rachel tried to hush him, whispering that this was not the place, but his words carried. My aunt caught every syllable, and by the time Rachel stormed off down the hall, the whispers had already spread. By evening, the relatives who had always defended her began to ask questions. Why was I the one paying deposits? Why had the hospital called me instead of her? Maggie stepped in, then her calm voice, steady recounting what she had seen. She told them how I had handled the emergency, how I had been the name on every form, the one who stood between life and death when our parents were rushed into surgery. Her words carried weight because she had no reason to embellish. She was simply a witness, and sometimes that was more powerful than any argument I could make. Vincent stopped by again with an update. He told me that all previous drafts of property transfers were frozen until my parents recovered enough for a proper legal evaluation. Rachel overheard and snapped that he was lying, but he produced the paperwork with my parents' signatures missing. Silence fell over the room. No one came to Rachel's defense this time. One afternoon, as the sun slanted through the blinds of the ICU, my mother stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and for the first time since the crash, she looked directly at me, not past me. Her hand reached out, weak but insistent, and I took it. Tears slipped down her face as she whispered that I was her pride, that she had been blind, that I was the one who had saved them. The words struck me harder than any insult she had thrown in the past. For years, I had been invisible, and now she was confessing what I had always known in my heart. I felt no triumph in that moment, only a deep ache that it had taken tragedy to make her see. My father, still pale against the sheets, turned his head slightly, as if to acknowledge what she said. His silence finally an admission. Around us, relatives exchanged glances, some ashamed, some surprised, most simply quiet. Rachel stood at the foot of the bed, her face tight with resentment, but she said nothing. That night alone in the hallway, I let the weight of it settle. Karma had come not with vengeance or spectacle, but with undeniable truth. The daughter they had ignored was the one keeping them alive, the one guiding the signatures, the one answering every question the doctors asked. Rachel's pedestal had collapsed, and though part of me longed to feel victorious, all I felt was tired. Still, I knew the story was not finished. My parents were stable, but recovery would take time, and with it would come more choices, more confrontations, and the question of what role I wanted to play when they finally left the hospital. I spent the following week in meetings with the billing office, insurance representatives, and social workers, making sure every step of my parents' care was handled correctly. The numbers were staggering, but because of their coverage and my diligence, the bulk of it was processed through the hospital's insurance partners. I signed what needed to be signed, not as their bank, but as their proxy, guiding the process with steady hands. Rachel offered nothing, slipping out of the building whenever responsibility pressed too close. One night, after a 12-hour shift, I left the ICU wing with aching feet and heavy eyes. Lucas was waiting in the parking lot. His truck warmed against the cold December air. He handed me a cup of coffee, kissed my forehead, and told me he had never been prouder. The simplicity of his words steadied me more than any hollow praise I had ever longed for from my parents. As we drove away, my phone buzzed with a message from Maggie. She had just finished her own shift and wrote that the entire unit admired how I had handled everything. She said the residents were calling me the calm in the storm. I stared at the glowing screen, realizing that recognition from people who truly saw me was worth more than decades of forced approval at family dinners. By the time my parents were transferred out of intensive care, I had already drawn the line for myself. I would continue to make sure their medical needs were met, but I would not sacrifice my own life or finances to be their savior. I arranged the follow-up care, worked with the rehab center to coordinate their recovery, and then handed the rest to the professionals. For once, I refused to be consumed. The day I finally walked out of Denver Health after signing the last set of discharge papers, the sun was breaking through the winter clouds. I stood at the entrance for a moment, breathing in the crisp air, letting the weight of everything fall away. Behind me, my parents rested alive because I had stepped forward when no one else could. In front of me, the city moved on, indifferent but full of possibilities. I did not need their apology to validate my worth. I did not need their inheritance or their staged affection. I had built something stronger, a life that belonged entirely to me. As I walked toward Lucas, waiting by the truck, I felt a calm pride settle in my chest. Maggie's words echoed in my mind, and for once, I believed them. If one day your own family turns their back on you, ask yourself this: would you keep waiting for their approval? Or would you step forward into the life you created for yourself? Would you choose forgiveness? Or would you choose to walk away stronger?